Yes.
Well, in speaking about, you brought that up, something that I know we wanted to discuss is the experience of being a Filipino-American, working in fields that maybe our parents, grandparents, our ancestors didn't think of. You know, when they're making a better life for their next of kin, they didn't exactly think, oh, they're gonna pursue these creative endeavors.
Right.
So I'm just curious if you could delve into some of those like internal pressures that you alluded to a little bit that come with being Filipino and being in your field.
Well, I think the story kind of there begins with some context, right? And I'll tell you, a lot of this stuff are things that I would say within the past year and a half, year or so, have really started to accept and really have started to give words to. So know that whatever I talk about as it relates to my culture, as it relates to line of work, comes from me, again, those three things, right? Super passionate about who I am and my cultural identity. At the same time, I want to know more, I want to be particular about sharing wisdom about what I've been able to receive from leaning into that part of me a lot more. And then thirdly, to be able to constantly be in that posture of learning, which means that some of these things that I know are probably part of a larger story.
Right.
But it's indeed something that I've interpreted and have taken the time to do, to learn about, to be able to get to even this point of explaining. So firstly, my passion. It took me a while to be passionate about my cultural identity. Really did. It was one of those things where I had grown up in not a non-traditional Filipino home. My grandpa on my mom's side was an executive at Eastman Kodak Company, so film, when they used to print pictures at Cesco, 1 hour photo. So film was already a big part of me, even though I didn't even know it through him. I think that's the perfect analogy, really, when it comes to understanding where they're coming from as it relates to why they're so hesitant. Because you can be familiar about something like movies and TV or any creative endeavor and be like, no, those are hobbies. Right? Those are things that you do on your off time. Those are things that you do that don't get you paid. What does get you paid is, blue collar work. If you're coming from a blue collar family, what also earns you money? Oh yeah, being an engineer, because like people need designers, you know. And in my case, my dad was an aeronautical engineer. So he designed airplanes. So like that makes money. But again, they're seeing a connection. Right? They're seeing a connection to something that they're familiar with that makes the opportunity turn into a career, which means that your career will take care of you and I don't have to worry about you anymore, right? I know you will be provided for beyond the time that I'm with you and can care for you. So here's the thing. That's not communicated well. That's not, right? And I don't mean to knock, Asian culture here, but I will in the sense when it comes to communicating emotions, right? And that in itself has a whole story and component to it because, again, our ancestors, what was foreign to them? Were feeling things and processing things. Whether you lived in the Philippines, right? There's still poverty in there, that I know that I was aware of and have heard stories from our family, which meant that the only priority for them was to survive and not feel, right? Like, hey, if you feel something, that whatever, all we need to do is just make money so that we can live the next day, so we can put food on the table. It wasn't described that way. It was just, there was no words to it. It was just like, that's not what it is. This is how we do. This is how we live. Suck it up.
Toughen up, buttercup.
No kawawa, right? No crying. We connect that history back to where we are now, right? We stand on the shoulders of our ancestors, not just in their jobs, not just in their cultural identity, but the fullness of who they are. That includes their emotional beings, right? Their emotional selves. And so again, we meet it to today, and even for people like myself, and I'm sure a lot of other Filipino-American who are in this middle ground between connecting what we do, if you work in a creative capacity, to your folks or other Filipinos who didn't grow up in that space because it's foreign to them and they don't know how to communicate what's going on in their head and their heart to be able to translate to you how much they really do. And here's the kicker, how much they actually really care and love you still. It just comes out differently because it's foreign to them. That's what's really interesting here is there's an underlying love that has always, I think, existed for Filipino moms and dads who grew up in the Philippines, who love their children. However, communicating that, just like any other culture, just like any other generation, really, it's difficult to try to communicate that out because they themselves have not been able to do that. This is a life that they've never imagined also. And so they're scared, they're hesitant. And so...
Have you had those conversations with your parents? How was that experience?
It took therapy. Hey, everybody should go to therapy. I'm just going to say that.
100%.
It really is helpful.
If I had a BetterHelp code right now, I would be...
Yeah, let's have them sponsor this episode now. Yeah, but I think it was a lot of doing the hard work. There's a lot of tainting that happens to what you want to pursue when you have misunderstanding, because that leads you into a period of hesitation of whether or not, again, you should, which is why I brought it up a moment ago earlier. There are people who are wise and there are people who are not wise. There are people who are wise but don't communicate it wisely. And that affects you when you don't understand the context on maybe why they are speaking to you and discouraging you away from the arts and away from a creative career because they don't know how to communicate that to you, and you receive that as discouragement. I mean, it does happen often, but I think you need to be able, in your maturity, your emotional maturity, as well as your life maturity, to be able to, when ready, park it, right? And really receive that and see how that makes you feel, and then start engaging with it. Right? Start engaging with the thought like, oh, well, I've never maybe even really asked them why. They've always been so dismissive about it. They've always discouraged it, but like, I'm doing stuff in that space now. Don't they see that? Reaching out to that part of you that makes it, that feels uncomfortable. I think that's when you understand the miracle, right? In someone, and you could see that happen in not only understanding, but you have people who hopefully parents or other fellow Filipinos or really anyone who will see not only what your ability is in those spaces, but will love you because you've explored those things even more. And when you do that, can you imagine really, what if that conversation changes? What if the conversation was like 10 years from now, however long, but down the road, you get to see your name and a credit on a movie that you worked on. Or a TV show that you wrote on, and you bring your family to that screening, family and friends screening, and they see your name. I'd argue that they would they're not going to just be proud that you worked on a movie. No. I think you, the person who's working in that creative space, will feel more free to be able to pursue it wholeheartedly even more. It's like, hey, they know where I am. They know the journey that I'm on. They understand it now. We understand each other. And so I can pursue and create in the most freedom that I have ever created in or worked in, with happiness and joy, so that when they do see the screening and they see my name, not only are they proud, but that we both understood each other and loved each other all the same throughout the entire process. And I think that's the cathartic thing that I hope for everybody, really. It's less about showing them that you made it, but it's more important that you have a conversation so that they understand more fully, and so that you and yourself can operate and work and create with freedom and with joy.
That's an incredible vision and goal to work towards, and I love you putting that out there in the universe. Two things that come to mind is the idea of not holding grudges against them, or using the motivation of proving them wrong versus proving yourself right. And maybe it's instead you try to show them what you can do, and here you go, this is what I can do, this is what I feel like I'm good at, and then let me just see where I can go with it. That's where you can get to that showing your name in the credits and whatnot. I think that's very beautiful. And another thing that you tapped on a little bit is, I think, something that I've personally had to kind of come to grips with, and as well as in talking to some of other fellow Filipinos, is the idea of the hierarchical relationship that a lot of Filipino families have. We're taught from a very young age, respect your elders, respect your elders. You know, when you see them, do the mano po, put their hand on your forehead. And also when they criticize you or when they say something that you don't like, you can't say anything. And I think for me, the moment where, because for example, in going into this internship with the CSU Entertainment Alliance, I remember showing her on Handshake, like, look, like they're looking for someone who wants to do podcasting, who is into marketing and whatnot. 2 things that I really like to do. And she was kind of like, you sure? Are you sure? And I instantly took it as like, she's doubting me. Like that sucks, and that kind of leads me down a path of just like, self-doubt. And I remember the moment that I started to see my mom as a human being, because I feel like for me, again, speaking on that hierarchical thing, you grow up thinking of your parents, you know, they're providing for you. It's kind of, for me, it's kind of like a dog where, you know, your dog knows who the provider is. Same for me is like, I understood that my parents and my mom, they're the ones that put the roof over my head and the food on the table and whatnot. So I respect it. Whatever they say is the lay of the land. And it wasn't until, you know, similar to what you were saying, 1.5 years ago, this past year, where I'm getting to know my parents almost again, you know, and they're getting to know me. And they, in a way, they've always known me. They always mentioned to me like, yeah, you're always in front of a camera. You always love making your little, you know, your little blockbusters. But we never in a million years expected you to actually want to do this for a living. You know, obviously, like we were mentioning before, the typical immigrant jobs in the medical field and all that stuff, like that's typically the stuff that I had pursued that, and it just wasn't working out for me. In getting to know my parents, them getting to know me, knowing how passionate I am about what I do, you know, that I'm good at it, that people believe in me. I think that's another thing that was new to me. I didn't know how to take it. Was outside people I've just met saying like, you know what, you kind of like this, I can see that. That's a whole nother conversation of like imposter syndrome and being like, ooh, really? You sure?
I go through that too, man. Yep.
Yeah, but it all starts with that hierarchical, you know, structure of families. And
yeah, my grandparents are the same way. Like I took them to the cafe a few weeks ago.
Wow.
Can you imagine, right? Like that was kind of like my moment, you know, like I'm still working on the movie and film side of things and haven't been able to bring them to, you know, a screening that has my name and a credit yet, but I was able to bring both my parents and my grandparents to my cafe, Copa Vida in Irvine. And man, like I've never seen them more glowing in my life. And that I felt that, what it means to succeed in even a cafe, a creative endeavor, you know, to be able to create a space where people can gather over delicious food and beverage and just do life with one another. Like, I mean, I'm doing that with my grandparents and my parents, and that makes me feel really good. Honoring them and the legacy and the hard work that they did in raising me, but also that I could just enjoy a meal with them.
A few moments later.
You know, toxic Filipino traits, you know, that's something that I was actually looking into that the other day, just because there are so many inside jokes and little things that being Filipino, you understand is part of the experience, you know. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what is one toxic trait you've personally had to let go, and what's one that maybe you're still working on. Like for me personally, the idea that acknowledging your mental health is being quote unquote maarte, or, you know, dramatic. Right. Whenever I was sad, it's always like, stop being maarte. Just come on, like put on a smile. Like this is not the situation right now. So it's like, okay, well, damn, that was actually like real emotion I was feeling there. I would like to talk about it, but go ahead, slap that wrist. You can sit down. And then one that I'm still working on. I went to a Catholic middle school, small class. Everyone knew each other. Everyone knew each other's parents. And because of that, I always found myself getting compared to Jason. Shout out to Jason if you ever watch this. He was top of the class, top of the, you know, head of the basketball team. I was also on the basketball team. And so it was very much like, from my perspective, always like, hey, you see Jason, he's over there working on like getting straight A's. Come on, you should do that too. So, and fast forward to now where social media, you have access to everybody.
Oh yeah, you can compare yourself constantly.
And everyone's always posting. For me, I always say social media is just like 1/10 of my life. And it's the good 10th. So that attitude has led to a lot of like, you know, self-loathing or like putting myself down. So that's something I'm working on still. How about yourself?
Yeah, thanks for sharing all that and being vulnerable in that way. It's interesting because, like, I think there are just toxic traits now, right? Like, so going into this whole leaning into our culture and stuff like that, like, I know people that I'm friends with who aren't Filipino who absolutely go through the same things that we do. I think what makes them super Filipino is because, again, like, the context, right? Now, we briefly touched on it here, but like, it's foreign. By defining it as just a toxic trait for me has allowed me to only embrace my Filipino side even more. So that's just a personal thing. It's just like I'm choosing to define it differently so I can have a different relationship with it. But because, I'm Filipino, let's just go with, it's a toxic trait, but experienced by a Filipino. There we go.
There you go. Yep.
Like what you'd mentioned, the whole imposter syndrome kind of deal. You go onto my Instagram or you just get to know me, and it's hard for people to put a finger on who I am. And I think there's some intention and purpose behind that, because I certainly don't like being boxed in. And I think there's some wisdom in also understanding that when you kind of introduce yourself at a party or a social gathering, it's always interesting how we often respond. We're often responding with like what our work is. I feel like when you do respond with your work, you're often identifying with the thing that you do as opposed to who you are. And you keep on repeating that to yourself and to other people. It eventually becomes one of those things where it's just like, oh, am I just that? Am I just an engineer, or am I just a business person, or am I just a marketer? And so I made a very conscious decision a few years back to be able to just say, hey, among other things, this is what I am, I have a hand in. But even being able to describe it to people now, like today, it's really weird. Like your whole intro of me was like, oh, like does all those things,
From all different...
And people will, from all different societies, I think there's a lot of people who operate in those very specific ways, like other cafe owners and people who work in film and TV. And they're like, no, I work in it because that's my full-time job. And I'm here to just say kindly to people, it's like, I also operate in this space as well, because I also love these areas of life. And it's an honor to be a part of them, and to facilitate these opportunities and be a steward of them as well. So that's all I'll say to that. I think sometimes I can get caught up with feeling, again, like I don't belong, like I shouldn't be a cafe owner, even film and TV, like, oh yeah, he's there, like he's present, and but I don't see the IMDb credits yet,
right.
Yeah, but imposter syndrome for sure creeps into there from time to time of saying,
we discussed this a little bit. There are some points to be taken that answer this question, but if you just had anything else regarding, if there's anyone out there that's pursuing, maybe an unorthodox endeavor, like a creative one, and they're in that space that we were, the family is not exactly accepting or just like just not exactly aware of what it is that you're doing. Do you have any other advice regarding starting that conversation and what that conversation exactly needs to be?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking that. I understand there's a lot of nuance here, right? Like,
a lot of variables,
a lot of things that I think are a lot easier said than done kind of things here, right? But I think there are two things that just come to mind right now is that, or I'll say three. One, I think it just begins with wanting to have that conversation. It's a very simple thing that gets overlooked, but like when you intentionally have a hard conversation with someone, I think both you and the party that's involved, I think, understand subconsciously that this is an important thing, right? Like when you pull a family member to the side or you invite someone to coffee and you kind of eventually lead there, I think you both understand that what we're going to talk about is going to be probably super painful. But we're going to have this because we both find this topic or this thing, this life aspect super important. So I think you should honor that first and foremost, right? Like you wanting to have a conversation, and then, when that person or, group of people want to have that conversation, you should for sure honor the yes that you both are giving. The second thing is that this doesn't happen immediately, right? Like there's probably going to be a conversation that you guys have, between your parents or whoever you have a tough relationship with as it relates to your work or even just in general. It may not resolve itself in that meeting. It may not resolve itself after 10 meetings. It may not resolve itself at all. But the point is that you do the time, right? Like resolution and reconciliation often happen when you, again, approach these things with humility and care, but also knowing that it's going to be a progressive process to try to find that resolution, right? Like it feels good to resolve it or feel like it's resolved in one meeting, but I just know that it's going to be an ongoing process to try to convince someone, especially as it is so familiar to them as we contextualize, again, this to the arts and working in a creative space, to people who don't understand that. Of course, they're not going to believe you at first. They're going to want proof. They're going to say, hey, like, no, clearly, like, there's zero money in your bank account right now, but you got to have these conversations. And I think that leads me to the third thing is that you have nothing to prove. Conversations don't have to prove anything. They just are a means of you being able to see someone for their fullest being, right? And just receiving who they are. Those are conversations. But you to be able to try to make a case for what you feel could be your career or what you feel could just be something that you want to pursue as it relates to your identity, like there's no one that needs to prove anything apart from you just accepting the reality that's who you are.